Well, historically, I've not been the healthiest eater, and I was able to get away with it for a long time because I was a runner, and I've been blessed, or at least I used to be blessed, with a great metabolism. Now, my wife, on the other hand, a little different story. She actually likes to eat salad and will choose it over anything else. She has very few eating vices. Now, me, on the other hand, I never met an unhealthy food I didn't like, whether it's ice cream or donuts or fried food. In fact, the year that I lived in Russia, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. I probably, the first half of the year, lived off of Snickers and Coke because food was a little challenging to come by, and we were trying to figure out how to live there. Now, even though I'm an unhealthy eater, I'm pretty good about going to the doctor. Now, probably there's some of you it's not your favorite thing to go to the doctor for your annual physical. Now, no nudging your spouse if they're not a fan of that, but I'm actually pretty good with that. And I go to the doctor, and I will say this, for a long time, the same thing would happen. I'd show up to the doctor, we'd run through all the numbers, there was a couple of minor medical things that we would discuss. And then at the end, he would invariably, or his nurse, would hand me a photocopy sheet of the Mediterranean diet. And I would take the sheet home, and I would set it next to my bed where I would see it periodically and think, I should read that sometime. And eventually, after a couple of weeks or maybe a month or two, I would pick it up and read it. And I'd read all about the Mediterranean diet. And then I'd think, maybe I should go eat at Olive Garden. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not what the doctor had in mind. So I'd grab a salad, I'd eat a handful of nuts, but before long, because my reality hadn't changed, I'd go back to eating whatever I felt like. Again, occasionally eating something healthy, but there was usually almost always ice cream every night. And then that began to change a few years ago. I hit my mid-50s, and I went in and I had a conversation with the doctor. And he began to help reframe my reality in a little different way than just handing me the Mediterranean diet. I began to see that if I continued to eat in an unhealthy manner, it was going to have long-term impacts. And so I began to make adjustments. And then a shocking thing happened. I actually felt better. Especially after lunch, after skipping fried food, eating a little bit more balanced or healthy lunch, I felt more alert, I felt more awake. Now, I have to confess, I still eat at Chick-fil-A occasionally. I have discovered that they have great salads, though nothing beats an 8-piece fried nugget and waffle fries. But just as our physical diets impact our bodily health, what we consume in our minds and what we consume spiritually sets the course for our souls. You see, our diet determines our direction. Now, I think for many of us, just like it's easy for us to find ourselves consuming unhealthy food, it's easy in other ways to consume a junk food diet of entertainment and social media distraction. Throw in a side of streaming news, particularly in election season, and we can find ourselves existing in probably a pretty unhealthy place. And I know the challenge of waking up in the morning and you click on the first news story, and before you know it, you're deep down the rabbit hole of everything that's going on in the world. Now, I want to remind us a little bit about what we consider normal today. It hasn't always been normal. Now, it started in kind of the late 80s with the development of the 24-hour news cycle. For those of you who are around, which I know I recognize there are some of you that weren't around, it seems like a long time ago, but cable news created 24 hours news cycle. And then you add to that the invention of the internet, mobile devices, and then social media over time, and we effectively have a perfect storm of information coming at us, a lot of it negative. And as the amount of the information has increased, that information has to work harder to get through and break through to grab our attention. And so during that same time period, it's interesting that research has taken place that determined that we actually pay way more attention to negative news and we remember it longer than we do positive news. Now, I'm sure this isn't a surprise for those who write news stories because this isn't a recent invention. But you can see why, as the amount of information is increased and it's trying to grab our attention, I think increasingly news stories try to leverage angles which amplify fear and anger. Now, there's other research that has taken place in that same time frame that shows that consumption of negative news can increase our feelings of pessimism and cynicism. And during the same time, during that same 40-year period, anxiety, fear, and anger have all increased to significant degrees. Now, one data point, the National Institute of Mental Health says that approximately 40 million adults in the U.S. experience some form of anxiety disorder. Now, if you want a little perspective on this, Susie and I watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, a couple of years ago. It's a fascinating documentary that talks about the algorithms which kind of continue to engage us and keep us addicted to social media. And it talks about how that creates echo chambers and creates some of the polarization that we all experience. But the documentary asks some important questions about how we consume media and news. Now, I don't think it would be fair to blame everything that's happened, all the increase on fear, anxiety, and anger, on the invention of social media and the smartphone. But I also don't think we can ignore it either. Because what we consume in our diets, our mental and our spiritual diet, does influence our life's direction and our appetites with regard to God's kingdom, what we've been talking about for this last 3 weeks. You see, again, our diet determines our direction. And I think the Apostle Paul, who was a church planter in the early church, saw this. And so we're going to take a look at something he wrote in the book of Colossians chapter 3. And so grab a Bible or load up your Bible app. It's going to be on page 988 if you're using one of our Bibles. Again, a little background and context. Paul was a leader in the early church. In fact, he planted churches all over the Greek and Roman worlds. And he's writing a letter to a church, not one that he planted, but it was a church that sprung up as a result of another church that he planted. And he's writing these letters because he's concerned about false teaching, either that he thought they were going to come under the influence of or that they were currently under the influence. And Paul spends the first part of this book, the first 2 chapters in particular, focusing on 2 truths. He focuses on the person of Jesus, basically how he is a central figure in our faith, and Jesus' authority. And then he reminds this church of their identity, who they are in Jesus contrasted to who they used to be. And then in chapter 3, Paul reaches a turning point, and he challenges them to lean into these heavenly realities. And this is what he says to them in chapter 3, verse 1. Since you've been raised to a new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits at the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about things of heaven, not the things of earth. So Paul is telling them to set their sights, to think about, to focus on, to strive to find. And when I hear his words, I think about Jesus' words to his followers, to seek first his kingdom, to think about it. And this idea of thinking about it is an ongoing conversation. You know, sometimes we talk about being mindful or something, keeping something in our present consciousness. And that's what Paul is talking about here. He's talking about something active, something regular, something that we continue to bring to mind, not just a periodic or a one-time activity. Paul is talking about what we're regularly consuming and thinking about and engaging in with our hearts and our minds. And so I'm going to read this again, but I want to focus on a little bit different to think about what he's wanting us to think about. Since you've been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits at the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about things of heaven, not things of earth. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to the whole world, you will share in all his glory. Now, this word or this phrase, real life, when you think about it, what do you think about? I'm guessing for you, it may conjure up images of kind of the physical, material world that we can engage with, that we can experience or touch. Or you may be thinking about everyday life, things with your family or your work or with school, those activities that we engage with all the time. Or real life may mean to you kind of unfiltered expressions of life as opposed to the curated versions that we see presented online. And these are all things that I think we tend to think about, but I think what Paul is doing is he wants us to think about something differently. And so I want to go back to verse 1, and there's this phrase in verse 1 that talks about the realities of heaven. It's this idea of real life or realities of heaven, and I want to get nerdy, a little nerdy for a moment. When the New Testament was written, about 90% of it was written in the Greek language. That was the language that people would write and communicate with back in the day. And so anytime somebody is trying to translate it into English or to another language so we can understand it, they're trying to translate it in a way that makes sense to us as readers while maintaining as close as possible to the original text and the original intent. And so this phrase that the realities of heaven actually means above and a higher place. In fact, the NIV translation, which is the version that I grew up with, says this: set your hearts on things above. But the New Living Translation translates that a little differently, because I think when we hear the words set your hearts or set your mind on things above, it sounds a little bit like Paul is telling us to walk around with our heads in the cloud, offering heavenly platitudes to real problems. And I think of the phrase, there are some people who this is the kind of faith that they live, and you hear the phrase, they're so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. But this isn't what Paul is talking about, because that's not the way Paul lived. You have to remember that Paul suffered way more than most of us for his faith. Paul was beaten on multiple occasions. He was shipwrecked 3 times, and he lived most of his ministry life, or much of his ministry life, in prison. In fact, he's writing this letter to the church, to this church, while he's under house arrest. And so what is Paul talking about when he says things above or the realities of heaven? And I think he's really wanting us to think about 3 things. He's wanting us to think about what is true. And again, as I mentioned, the first part of the book, he's talking about the fact that Christ is seated in the heavenly throne room. And Paul was a Jew, and to the Jews, they believed that the only person that sat in heaven was God. And so when Paul says that Christ is seated in heaven, he's equating Jesus, the person of Jesus, with God. And then he says he's seated at the right hand, at the place of honor. And what he's saying there is that he's in a place of authority. And that place of authority is right next to God the Father. And he's not just sitting there passively. He's sitting there on our behalf. He's interceding for us. He's standing there as our advocate. Now, for Paul, this whole idea wasn't just theory, because he'd encountered the resurrection Jesus. You have to remember that Paul started out and he persecuted the church, and he had this encounter which completely changed the direction of his life. In fact, the transition in Paul's life was so radical that people didn't even believe that it was true at first. They thought that it was a trick or a ploy, and that he was going to use this, the fact that he was trying to connect with the church, as a way to arrest and imprison them. Paul's transformation was significant, and something significant happened. And Paul wants us to think about this reality that Jesus sits on the throne, and that he's far above, and there's nothing in this world that happens without his notice. But he also wants them to keep track or keep focus on their identity. And again, Paul focuses a lot on what their identity was and what this new identity that Jesus has given them. And when Paul thinks about what's true, what he wants us to do is those things that we might call real life, Paul wants us to think about real life differently. He wants to redefine what we experience and how we experience life on this earth through the reality of God in heaven and through this new identity. Now, you may not yet be a follower of Jesus, but one of the things that I would, and if that's not you, I would challenge you to think about what reality or what truth are you basing your life upon? Because as followers of Jesus, that's the place we go when things are difficult or challenging or we don't understand. We can rest in the fact that our Heavenly Father and that Jesus sits on the throne. So Paul wants us to think about what's true, but he also wants us to think about what lasts. You know, last year we spent a lot of time talking about the one person that God has asked us to build our life into, to pray for, that we believe needs to come to a relationship in Jesus. And the truth is that there's so many things that we spend time and energy focused on in this world that are not going to last. And that's why Paul spends so much time reminding them about their identity. And their identity isn't just something that takes place on this earth, but it begins here on this earth, and it continues on throughout eternity. And Paul wants them to think about what's going to last in this life. And the last thing, when he talks about realities of heaven, he wants them to think about what's good. And then the verses that follow the ones that we read, Paul spends a lot of time contrasting this idea of heavenly things versus earthly things. In verse 5, for instance, he says, "Put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you." And so when Paul is telling us to think about things of heaven, it's what we've been talking about these last few weeks. He's talking about the kingdom of God. He's talking about kingdom realities and God's way of living in this world. Because you see, if we understand what's true and what's last and what's good, we begin to see our world differently and we begin to live our lives differently. You see, keeping those things in perspective allow us to live with the big picture in mind. It puts everything in its proper context. And when we understand what's true, we begin to not just react to things that are happening to us, but we can respond in a way that reflects God's heart and God's purposes, even when things are hard. And when we focus on those things that are going to be most important and that are going to last, it helps us live the kind of life that honors God. You see, Paul knows that if we want to be kingdom people that live with a kingdom perspective, that live as kingdom citizens with a kingdom mission in mind and live in a way that maintains kingdom unity, we have to consume a kingdom diet. You see, friends, our diet determines our direction. Our diet determines our direction. And the things that we consume in our mind and our hearts are going to impact, just like our physical bodies, what our energy level and our effectiveness and our focus is to do on kingdom things. You know, one of the things that we like to say around here is that our identity determines our activity. And what we mean by that is when we understand and we've got our identity as followers of Jesus in view, then everything we do will tend to flow out of that. But the truth is, if we're living our lives distracted and focusing on the wrong things, then we begin to lose sight of that identity. We begin to forget who we really are. Now, last week, I read part of the verses from the Message translation, and it's actually a paraphrase, but I want to read some verses, these same verses, this week. And again, this is a paraphrase, so it's not a true translation. It's more translating the ideas. But I think this translation of Paul's words really gets to the heart of what Paul is wanting us to do. And it says this, and the words will be on the screen. So if you're serious about living this new resurrection life with Christ, act like it. Pursue the things over which Christ presides. Don't shuffle along, eyes to the ground, or if I was doing this translation today, I might say eyes to the phone. Don't shuffle along with eyes to the phone, absorbed with the things right in front of you. Look up, Be alert to what is going on around Christ. That's where the action is. See things from his perspective. Your old life is dead. Your new life, which is your real life, even though invisible to spectators, is with Christ in God. He is your life. Our diet determines our direction. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about what we consume that comes at us, either from news or social media or whatever, but stuff that comes at us from the outside. But I think when we talk about what we're consuming, we have to spend a few moments thinking about what we consume from the inside. Because for some of us, that internal self-talk, that self-critique, maybe a voice from your past, either of a parent or another family member, that's actually as distracting or destructive in your mind and heart as anything that you're consuming from the outside. So hear me when I say it's not just what we consume from the outside, it's what we keep running on inside of us. And so when we think about what it looks like to develop a kingdom diet, we need to think about what we're consuming from the outside, but also what we continue to consume from inside of us. And so I want to spend a couple of moments just thinking about how do we consume a kingdom diet. And I think the first thing is just to simply become aware of what you are consuming. You know, when I began to change my diet, the first thing I did before I started to change anything is I started to just become aware of what I was consuming. And I started by actually reading labels on things. And I know that sounds super simple, but when I decided to go get some ice cream, our family loves Grater's ice cream. I don't consume nearly as much of it as I used to. And when I would go grab it, I was a little shocked the first time I read that one serving of Grater's has 26 grams of fat, 13 grams of saturated fat per serving. I was like, man, that's a lot of fat. Now, if you're a Grater's fan, hopefully you can block that out of your mind the next time you go. But simply understanding what I was consuming and how much of it I was consuming began to change my thinking. And we can do a similar thing with what we consume or paying attention to how we consume media. For instance, most of us spend a lot of time on our phones. If you've got an iPhone, you can simply turn on screen time and begin to track and pay attention to how much time and what apps are you spending the most time on. You can do a little bit of a media tracking. Or you can just simply create a little journal and see how much time you're spending on different activities. You could also use a journal to think about how often are some of those negative thoughts or those negative self-talk coming back to you. And I think as you do that, you can begin to think about what needs to be removed from your diet. Now, just paying attention to what and how much of what we're consuming, I think, is the first step. But I think there's a second level of awareness, and I think paying attention to how what you're consuming impacts you. And just like I'm shocked at how many different diets there are out there, I think just like different physical diets affect people differently, I think paying attention to how what we consume impacts us each differently. For instance, I think we all tend towards either fear or anxiety or anger. And I think paying attention to which one of those things we tend towards and trying to understand kind of what's beneath the iceberg, because that emotion is often kind of just the tip. And understanding kind of what is beneath that and what triggers us and why is the second part of understanding. But I think awareness of what you're consuming is where it begins. And I think once you're aware, then it's a little easier to begin to think about what we need to change in our life. Now, Paul, in this letter to the Colossians, uses a different word picture other than diet, but he begins to talk about what the next two steps that we need to do are. He uses the word picture or the analogy of getting dressed. Now, for most of us, getting dressed is fairly simple. We take off our old clothes and we put on new clothes. Now, that is assuming that you don't, it's a daily activity unless you work from home or you're doing virtual school. But for most of it, it's generally a daily activity. We take off one thing and we put on something else. And that's what Paul uses in this analogy. As you read through the book of Colossians, what you see is he says, take off these things and put on these new things. Take off old practices that bring death, like sexual immorality or greed or anger or anxiety, and put on new things, things like humility and gentleness and peace and love. And again, we can do the same thing with our spiritual diets. We need to replace one thing with another. And so once we're aware of what we're consuming, we can begin to think about what's the junk food that needs to be eliminated from our mental or our spiritual diets. For some of us, we need to maybe create a break from social media, or maybe you create a social media fast where you park your phone for a few hours, or maybe even for a whole day. Or maybe for you, if news tends to generate anger or fear, maybe you just need to have certain times a day where you don't go to that. Or maybe for you, it's to reduce the unhealthy self-talk. And again, I think sometimes as we try to change behavior, it's easy for us to say, I'm going to muster up the effort to do it alone. And I would challenge you not to try to do it alone. Talk to a friend or a spouse or maybe your small group about these are the things that I'm trying to change. You can also reach out to us here at the church. We do these things called care appointments where maybe if you're just processing, hey, this is an unhealthy pattern in my life, how do I begin to think about changing it? We would love to have a conversation. But once you begin to work on reducing or eliminating some of the junk food in your diet, it's not enough to just take things away. You need to replace them with new habits or new things that are healthy. We need to replace lies with truth. And so, for instance, if you're challenged with social media, maybe you do the thing that we talked about the first week, the It Starts With Us challenge, which is a challenge that encourages you to engage with social media in different ways. Or maybe you need to consume more scripture. And during the next couple of weeks, I would encourage you, if you're looking for a hopeful book to read, I would read this letter that Paul wrote to the Colossians, because there is lots of perspective and hope and truth in it, and it's hope and truth that we need to take inside of us. Or if you have a particular thing that you struggle with, maybe you struggle with fear, or for me, for a long time, I've wrestled a lot with anxiety, and it's not totally gone, but I don't wrestle with it the same way that I used to. And so for me, I memorized some verses from a previous letter that Paul wrote, and it's from Philippians, the book of Philippians, chapter 4. And it's some simple words that say, the Lord is near, which sounds very similar to what Paul wrote in this letter. And then he says, do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. For me, I've had to take those words in and try to begin to shift a way of thinking that generates anxiety. And then one last suggestion of healthy things that we should add to our diet is simply prayer. We talk about Jesus sitting on the throne, and one of the things that prayer does, it's a powerful tool because it connects our hearts with that heavenly throne room. And as followers of Jesus, we can enter into God's presence, and we can connect with him, and we can open our hearts and our minds to the truth that he wants to pour into us. You know, a funny thing began to happen as I began to change my physical diet. I noticed that I began to change. The foods that my body craved began to shift a little bit. My taste changed. And I actually find myself beginning to enjoy healthier foods. I actually enjoy a salad. Sometimes my wife and I will split a salad or I'll sample hers. Now, if I'm honest, I still love donuts and ice cream, though I don't eat them as nearly as much. And when I do eat too much junk, I regret it pretty quickly. But the way and what I've consumed has begun to change who I am. And I like how Paul ends this section of the scriptures as he begins to talk about how what we consume begins to come out in our lives. And he says this in verse 16, "Let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives." And as we wrap up today, I think sometimes we need a little bit of perspective. You know, next Sunday is International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians. And I was looking at the stats, and the stats are that there's 365 million Christians worldwide who suffer high levels of persecution and discrimination. Read one story about Christians in Gaza who not only live in a majority Muslim area, but are living in the midst of a war zone and the challenge of living as a believer in that context. And I am confident that the only way that they get through the days is by continuing to focus on the truth that Jesus is on his throne, and that in spite of their difficulties, that Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, walks with them each day. Now, I don't know who's going to win the presidential election in the next couple of weeks, but here's what I know. Jesus is on his throne, and as we stay focused on our identity as his sons and daughters, we can continue to walk the next few weeks and months with courage and peace and love and hope. And let's continue to do that.